Importance of heritage legislation for Cavite City heritage conservation. Heritage legislation refers to laws and regulations that are enacted to protect and preserve cultural heritage. These laws aim to safeguard tangible and intangible heritage assets, such as historic buildings, cultural landscapes, artifacts, traditions, and other forms of cultural expressions. The purpose of heritage legislation is to ensure the long-term conservation, management, and sustainable use of these heritage resources for present and future generations. Designation and protection. Cavite City heritage legislation will establish the processes for identifying, designating, and protecting heritage assets. This may include the creation of city heritage lists, inventories, or registers to officially recognize and protect sites, structures, or practices with cultural significance. Preservation and conservation. Cavite City heritage legislation will outline the requirements and guidelines for the preservation, conservation, and maintenance of the city heritage assets. This may involve regulations regarding appropriate restoration techniques, conservation standards, and maintenance practices to ensure the long-term integrity and authenticity of cultural heritage. Planning and development control. Cavite City heritage legislation should incorporate provisions related to planning and development control. These regulations aim to mitigate potential impacts on heritage assets from new construction, infrastructure projects, or land use changes. It can include impact assessments, heritage impact studies, and permit processes to ensure that development activities do not harm or compromise cultural heritage values. Heritage funding and financial incentives. Cavite City heritage legislation should include provisions for funding mechanisms and financial incentives to support the city heritage conservation. This may involve government grants, tax incentives, or financial assistance programs for property owners or organizations involved in city heritage preservation activities. Public engagement and education. Cavite City heritage legislation should emphasize public engagement and education by encouraging community participation in city heritage conservation initiatives. It may include provisions for public consultation, awareness campaigns, and educational programs to promote understanding, appreciation, and stewardship of cultural heritage. Enforcement and penalties. Cavite City heritage legislation must establish measures to enforce compliance with heritage protection regulations. These measures can include penalties for unauthorized alterations or destruction of heritage assets, as well as systems for monitoring and inspection to ensure adherence to the regulations. Effective heritage legislation requires collaboration among various stakeholders, including government agencies, heritage experts, local communities, property owners, and organizations involved in heritage conservation. The legislation should be supported by adequate resources, capacity-building initiatives, and ongoing monitoring and evaluation to ensure its effectiveness in preserving and safeguarding cultural heritage. Heritage conservation, on the other hand, refers to the practice of actively managing and protecting cultural heritage assets. It involves a range of activities and strategies aimed at preserving the integrity, significance, and accessibility of heritage resources. Conservation efforts can include documentation, research, restoration, adaptive reuse, interpretation, and public engagement initiatives to ensure the sustainable use and appreciation of cultural heritage. Overall, heritage legislation and conservation work hand in hand to protect and preserve cultural heritage for future generations, ensuring that the unique and irreplaceable aspects of Cavite City's shared human history and identity are safeguarded and celebrated.